President Trump is having a rally. Oklahoma being criticized for that because of the violation of social distancing. Dr. Mark Siegel, the Fox News doctor paid contributor, says if we're going to have protests, we can certainly have rallies. My guest is the author of the book, Great Society, A New History. She also wrote the profoundly important book, The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression. This one talks about the Great Society and the promises that were made and the reality. Amity Shlaes, you also say this in your book, quote, black unemployment, which had been the same as whites in the 1950s, from the early 1960s rose above white unemployment. The gap between black and white unemployment widened. Welfare programs funded by Presidents Johnson and Nixon expanded roles to an appalling extent, appalling because welfare fostered a new sense of hopelessness and disenfranchisement among those who received it, end of quote. That was the opposite of what, of course, they intended to happen, right?
Yes. Well, you want to think, why did black unemployment, and particularly black youth unemployment, digress so far from white unemployment in this period? And one reason actually gets to what the socialists want. Social Democrats and socialists and regular Democrats and some Republicans want a high minimum wage. That was very important. It sounds fair, right? Mm-hmm. Why oppress the lowest earners? But what happens when you raise the minimum wage is often employers hire fewer people, or they hire those with the most education in the area of the job. And that often means black Americans don't get the job. Milton Friedman, who was studying this problem in the 50s and the 60s, wrote that the minimum wage was the most anti-black law on our statute books, mm-hmm. because it actually hurt black Americans so disproportionately. Unions, the same thing. Unions like high wages. That's their reason they exist, to get high wages. They get very high wages, so they end up who ends up not being hired, those who are the least qualified but perhaps the most hopeful for the job, and then those people don't get a chance to become qualified. Mm-hmm. Welfare was also a factor. Welfare exploded in the 1960s. It's just the fact of the story. Everyone was quite concerned about welfare, and when you receive a high payment, or which seems a relatively high payment, you tend to want to work less. You get out of the habit of work. That's white or black. And that's also true right now, by the way. There's some wonderful papers at the National Bureau of Economic Research about concerns that if we pay people too much when they stay home, they're less interested in going back to work, even though they're not happy at home with what still seems like not enough money. They just get in the way of staying home. So that is what happened in the 60s, and it led to sort of a trend of longer-term unemployment and of misery, and an acceptance of welfare that was very unhappy for the families that did accept welfare, sort of a way of life instead of a temporary help. People always ask me about food stamps, and we can say anytime it's no shame to be on food stamps. But what is a shame for all of us is when you expect your grandchildren to be on food stamps just as you are. That is perpetual food stamps down the generations. And that's what began or accelerated in the 60s. Food stamps also exploded in that period.
Amity Shlaes, I have been saying for years, and your book gives me even more confidence in saying this, I've made the argument that the welfare state has incentivized women to marry the government and has allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility.
Well, it seems that's so from the evidence. You know, in the book, I track a tragic and interesting and tragic housing project called Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. There's a great movie about it, by the way, too, that I think you can get on Netflix or Amazon. Anyway, this trend of welfare kicking the dad out or requiring there be no dad began before the Great Society, but it wasn't. That disincentive was not removed, notwithstanding some efforts during the Great Society. So it paid for women, unfortunately, not to have a dad around. And in the Pruitt-Igoe movie, there's a wonderful and just heartbreaking testimony from a young man who said, we had to lie about my dad. We had to lie and say he wasn't around when he was. We had to lie when we said maybe we had a dad. we would say we didn't. And in the Pruitt-Igoe complex, this is no exaggeration, dads would hide in the closet. So the social work lady wouldn't see them. Social work in the 60s grew very fast, just as now, in part over concern.
Amity, we're going to take a break. We're going to take a break right here. Amity, we come back. I want to ask you, what do we do about this? Do we undo it? What do we do about all of this? And what do you think about all the spending that's been going on since the Trump administration has been in?